March 9, 1945. West bank of the Rhine River near Remagen, Germany. The air reeked of cordite and diesel. Smoke rolled low over the riverbanks, thick as fog curling around broken trees and burned-out trucks. American soldiers crouched in muddy trenches, eyes fixed on the dark ribbon of water ahead, the Rhine, the last great barrier to Hitler's heartland. Sergeant Bill Carter of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion spat into the mud, gripping his rifle tight. The water glimmered in the pale morning light, wide and fast-moving, carrying the wreckage of war, twisted wood, torn metal, and the bodies of soldiers who had tried and failed to cross. He'd been an engineer for 18 months now, ever since landing at Normandy. He'd built Bailey bridges in France, cleared mines in Belgium, repaired roads under artillery fire. But the Rhine was different. The Rhine was legend, a barrier that had protected Germany since Roman times. Behind him, trucks growled to life, engines rumbled, orders shouted. Something was happening. "Get ready, boys," yelled Captain Charles Reichenbach, standing on the embankment, clipboard in hand. "We're building a bridge, here, today." Carter blinked. "Sir, we just got here. The crowds are shelling the river every 5 minutes. Reichenbach didn't flinch. "Then we'll build it between the shells." The men exchanged looks. A bridge? Across this? The Rhine was over 400 yards wide, swollen with spring melt. German artillery on the far bank pounded anything that moved. The last bridge, the Ludendorff at Remagen, had already collapsed days ago under enemy fire and its own structural damage, though not before thousands of troops had crossed. Private Eddie Kowalski, a 19-year-old from Chicago, swallowed hard. "Captain, with all due respect, that's suicide." "No," Reichenbach replied, his voice steady. "That's engineering." But orders were orders. The Allies needed armor across, and they needed it now. The impossible assignment. What the men didn't know was that their mission was part of a larger strategy that had been planned for months. The Rhine represented more than just a river. It was Germany's psychological fortress, the ancient boundary that separated the German heartland from the conquered territories. For Hitler and his generals, losing the Rhine meant losing Germany itself. They had spent months fortifying the eastern bank, planting mines, building bunkers, positioning artillery. They had destroyed every bridge for hundreds of miles, confident that the swollen spring river would buy them time. Time to reorganize, to bring up reserves, to launch counterattacks. But what they hadn't counted on was engineering. The U.S. Army Engineer Corps had been preparing for this moment since 1943. They had studied every aspect of river crossing: current speeds, soil composition, bridge construction techniques. They had developed new equipment, improved pontoons that could withstand heavy armor, prefabricated sections that could be assembled in minutes, specialized vehicles for launching bridge components, and they had trained relentlessly. In England, in North Africa, in Italy, anywhere there was water, engineers practiced. They built bridges under simulated fire. They timed themselves, competed, perfected their craft until bridge building became second nature. Now, standing on the banks of the Rhine, all that training would be put to the test. The first sections. The engineers got to work. Bulldozers crawled forward, shoving debris aside. Trucks backed in and dumped pontoons, long metal floats that would form the skeleton of the bridge. The men moved fast, hands numb from cold, wrenches clanging against steel. Corporal Michael Santos directed traffic, his voice hoarse from shouting over the engine noise. "Pontoon section 3 to the left. Move it, move it. We're losing daylight." Each pontoon weighed over a ton, massive steel cylinders designed to float while supporting the weight of tanks. Getting them into position required coordination between crane operators, truck drivers, and the men in the water itself. And yes, men in the water. Engineers waded into the frigid Rhine, water up to their chests, guiding pontoons into place with ropes in their bare hands. The current was strong enough to knock a man off his feet. The temperature cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," muttered Private Danny O'Brien, teeth chattering as he fought to keep his grip on a pontoon cable. "This water's colder than my ex-wife's heart." "Keep moving, Danny," Sergeant Carter shouted. "Complain after we're done." Overhead, the sky roared as P-47 Thunderbolts dove across the river, strafing German gun positions to keep their heads down. The ground shook as artillery fired in return, each explosion sending fountains of mud skyward. Still, the engineers didn't stop. Every section of pontoon was manhandled into place, chained together, and anchored against the current. Wooden planks clattered across the frames. The men moved with mechanical rhythm. Hammer, tighten, secure, repeat. Lieutenant Milner checked his watch. They'd been at it for only 3 hours. Already the bridge was taking shape, a thin gray line creeping across the black water. A passing infantryman stopped to stare, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You guys are crazy." Milner smiled grimly. "Yeah," he said, "but we're fast." Under fire. By noon, the bridge stretched halfway across the Rhine. The Germans, realizing what was happening, opened fire with everything they had. Artillery shells screamed overhead and burst on the near bank. Shrapnel tore through the air, pinging off equipment, shredding canvas, finding flesh. A pontoon section took a direct hit, exploding in a geyser of water and twisted metal. "Medic!" someone screamed. 2 men were down, one clutching his leg, blood seeping between his fingers, the other motionless on the muddy bank. Medics rushed forward, but the other engineers kept working. They had to. Stopping meant failure. Failure meant the offensive stalled. Stalling meant more men would die on some other battlefield. "Replace that section," Captain Reichenbach bellowed. "Now!" A fresh pontoon was dragged forward. Men swarmed over it, bolting it in place even as German machine gun fire kicked up dirt around them. The distinctive buzz of MG-42s ripped through the air at 1,200 rounds per minute. Private Kowalski dove behind a pontoon as bullets sparked off steel inches from his head. His heart hammered, his hand shook, but when the firing paused, he stood up, picked up his wrench, and went back to work. That's what they all did. Not because they were fearless, fear soaked every man to his bones, but because the men beside them were doing the same thing, because stopping wasn't an option, because this was the job. The mathematics of war. What made the American engineers so effective wasn't just courage or training, it was systems thinking. Every bridge construction followed a precise sequence, broken down into standardized steps. Each man had a specific role. Equipment was pre-positioned. Materials were standardized so any section could fit any bridge. Radio communications kept everyone coordinated. It was industrial warfare applied to engineering. Henry Ford's assembly line translated to battlefield construction. The Germans, on the contrary, relied on skilled craftsmen building custom solutions for each situation. Their bridges were often better, more elegant, more durable, but they took days or weeks to build. The Americans built bridges that were good enough, strong enough to carry tanks, fast enough to beat the enemy's response time. They could be built by ordinary soldiers with basic training, and most importantly, they could be built under fire. This difference in philosophy would prove decisive. The first crossing. By 1600 hours, just 7 hours after the first pontoon entered the water, the bridge was complete. When the first tank rolled forward, an M4 Sherman, its trads clanking on the wooden planks, the men stopped for a moment to watch. The bridge swayed slightly under the 30-ton weight. The pontoons dipped and rose with the current, but the structure held. Some engineers cheered, others just slumped down in exhaustion, faces streaked with mud and sweat. Corporal Santos lit a cigarette with trembling hands and stared at what they'd built. 7 hours, he said to no one in particular. We just built a bridge across the Rhine in 7 goddamn hours. Captain Reichenbach walked the length of the bridge, inspecting every connection, every bolt. When he reached the far side, German soil, he turned and looked back at his men. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel it. Pride. Not in himself, but in them. Farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college kids who'd never touched a wrench before the war. Now they were master builders constructing, under fire, what peacetime engineers said was impossible. 10 hours after the first order was given, the U.S. Army had done the impossible. A fully functional bridge spanned the Rhine, strong enough to carry tanks, men, and trucks straight into Germany. From the far bank, German soldiers stared in disbelief.
They had watched the bridge rise out of the river like a machine from another world, built faster than they thought humanly possible, under shell fire, in a single day. One captured officer later told an interrogator, shaking his head in bewilderment, "We destroyed one bridge in the morning. By sunset, the Americans had built another. We couldn't believe it. Your engineers, they are nicked mention, not human." The interrogator, a captain from Army intelligence, simply smiled. They're just Americans doing their job. But for the men who had built it, there was no time for awe. They had another crossing to make, another river, another order to follow. And each time, the enemy would learn the same lesson, that nothing could stop the engineers of the United States Army once they set their minds and their hands to the task. Part 2. The Night the Rhine was Conquered. March 22, 1945, Oppenheim, Germany. The night was quiet, almost too quiet.
A thick mist hung over the Rhine, muting the sound of boots on gravel and the distant rumble of artillery. Somewhere upriver, the city of Mainz burned, its orange glow bleeding through the fog like a dying ember. On the west bank, Colonel William M. Hogue, commander of the U.S. Engineer Special Brigades, studied a map under the dim light of a hooded lamp. His officers crowded around, their faces drawn and grim. Hogue was 51 years old, a veteran of World War I who had spent his entire adult life in the Engineer Corps. He had built roads in the Philippines in the 1920s, dams in the Pacific Northwest during the Depression, and landing craft ramps on D-Day. He was a builder by nature, a soldier by necessity. Now he faced perhaps the most challenging construction project of his life. "The 5th Infantry needs to be across by dawn," Hogue said, his finger tracing routes on the map. "The 276th and 552nd Engineer Battalions will start construction the moment we get the go signal." One lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, the Germans still hold the opposite bank. If they open up with artillery—" Hogue cut him off. "Then we build faster." He straightened, his breath misting in the cold air. "Gentlemen, we're not waiting for the enemy to quit shooting. The Rhine is the last wall between us and victory. We take it down tonight." The assault boats. At exactly 2100 hours, the first rafts slipped into the black water. Small, silent craft carrying infantrymen across to secure a foothold on the east bank. Private First Class James Washington, an engineer attached to the assault wave, gripped his M1 carbine and tried to keep his breathing steady. He'd volunteered for this mission, not because he was brave, but because someone had to go first. The rubber boat hissed through the water, paddles dipping silently. Around him, other boats formed a ghostly flotilla, invisible in the darkness and mist. On the far shore, German positions waited, machine guns, mortars, maybe even tanks. Washington had grown up in Alabama, the son of sharecroppers. He joined the army to escape poverty, never imagining he'd end up here, crossing rivers in darkness, heading straight toward enemy guns. But war had a way of taking you places you'd never planned to go. The boat touched the eastern shore with a soft crunch. Men leapt out, rifles ready, and disappeared into the night. Gunfire crackled in the distance. Flares arced into the sky, casting eerie shadows. Then, after what felt like hours, but was only 40 minutes, a radio crackled. "Beachhead secured, engineers cleared to proceed." Back on the western bank, Colonel Hogue raised his hand. "Go." Engines roared to life. Trucks lurched forward, headlights covered in blackout shields. Floodlights flickered on, cutting through the fog in narrow beams. The men moved like a swarm, unloading pontoons, bolting frames, hammering planks.
Sergeant Frank Nowak, a second-generation Polish immigrant from Pennsylvania, coordinated his squad with hand signals and shouted orders. Section 4, move up. We need that pontoon in the water now. Each pontoon was 30 feet long, made of corrugated steel and chained together in rows that floated with the current. Wooden treadways were laid across them, forming the road surface. Every bolt was tightened by hand. Every cable was locked in place by muscle and willpower. The work was grueling. The pontoons were heavy and awkward. The current fought every effort to position them. The cold, numbed fingers making simple tasks difficult, and over everything hung the constant threat of German artillery. By midnight, the first spans were already stretching out into the current. The Rhine hissed beneath them, black and cold, tugging at the floating bridge like an angry beast. Then the shelling began. Baptism by fire. German artillery began to fall, first sporadic, then constant. Explosions tore up the shoreline, splashing water and mud across the engineers. The night lit up with flashes, each one freezing the scene in strobe-like snapshots. Men diving for cover, equipment flying through the air, the bridge swaying on the dark water. One shell obliterated a pontoon section, hurling 2 men into the river. The icy water swallowed them instantly. "Man down! Man in the water!" someone screamed. A rescue team plunged in after them, fighting the current, searching by feel in the pitch darkness. They found one man, unconscious but alive, and dragged him to shore. The other was never recovered. Another name added to the casualty lists. Another family that would receive a telegram. But others ran forward without hesitation, dragging a new pontoon into place, bolting it down even as shrapnel whistled overhead. "Keep building!" someone shouted. "We're almost there!" Lieutenant Carl Schmidt, a former construction foreman from Milwaukee, moved along the bridge checking connections. Shrapnel had torn through his jacket, leaving his arm bleeding, but he ignored it. There would be time for wounds later. "This connection's loose," he shouted to a private. "Tighten it down or the whole section will fail when the tanks cross." The private, barely 18, his hands shaking from cold and fear, nodded shakily and went back to work with his wrench. The bridge crept forward, foot by foot, section by section, like a living thing defying destruction. By 300 hours, just 8 hours after the first truck arrived, the final section was locked in. A column of tanks began to roll across, engines growling, headlights dim. The bridge swayed slightly under their weight, creaking and groaning, but it held. Sergeant Nowak stood at the eastern end, directing traffic, and allowed himself one moment of disbelief. They'd actually done it, built a bridge across the Rhine, at night, under fire, in 8 hours. From the opposite bank, a German observer watched through binoculars, frozen in disbelief. He had seen bridges built in days, even weeks, never in a single night. His report to headquarters would later read, "The Americans are building faster than we can destroy. They cross rivers as if they were roads. Conventional defensive tactics are no longer effective." Dawn over the Rhine. At sunrise, Colonel Hogue walked to the center of the bridge, cigarette between his lips, coat flapping in the wind. He looked east toward the German heartland now exposed beyond the Rhine. The river that had protected Germany for 2,000 years had been crossed in less than a night. 8 hours, he murmured. That's all it took. The engineers around him grinned through mud-caked faces. Some laughed, the slightly hysterical laughter of men who've survived something that should have killed them. but others simply sat down on the steel deck, too tired to speak. Private First Class Washington, who'd crossed in the first assault wave and then worked all night helping build the bridge, stared at his hands. They were torn up, bleeding, blistered. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept, but he never felt more alive. They had done the impossible. Again. And the Germans watching from the far hills began to realize what it meant. If the Americans could cross the Rhine under fire, in darkness, in less than half a day, then there was nothing left that could stop them. The road to the end of the war had just been built, plank by plank, bolt by men who refused to slow down. Part 3. Operation Plunder. March 24th, 1945. Wesel, Germany. The morning broke in fire. The sky was a blur of motion. C-47 Dakotas, gliders, and B-25 bombers streaking east in a roaring formation that shook the air itself. Below them, across the wide gray Rhine, lay the largest Allied crossing operation since D-Day. Operation Plunder had begun. This wasn't a hasty crossing under cover of darkness. This was Montgomery's grand set-piece battle, meticulously planned, overwhelmingly resourced, designed to smash through German defenses with unstoppable force. On the West Bank, General Montgomery's forces prepared to strike. To the south, the U.S. Ninth Army, under General William Simpson, waited for the signal to cross, the engineers already setting the stage. Trucks
rolled in endless lines, stacked high with pontoon sections, cables, and lumber. The men of the 150th Engineer Combat Battalion worked wordlessly, their faces pale with exhaustion and determination. They'd been building bridges for weeks now, across the Ruhr, the Erft, smaller tributaries. Each crossing brought them closer to this moment, the final Rhine crossing that would break Germany's back. The Brooklyn Kid. Among them was Corporal Frank DeLuca, 21 years old, from Brooklyn. His hands were blistered raw from wrenching bolts and hauling steel for 2 straight days. As artillery thundered in the distance, he wiped sweat from his eyes and looked out at the river. "It doesn't end, does it?" he muttered. Beside him, Sergeant Tom McCaffrey smirked. McCaffrey was a 30-year-old career soldier, a regular army man who'd been building bridges since before Pearl Harbor. It ends when Berlin does. DeLuca had joined up in 1943, inspired by newsreels and patriotic speeches. He'd imagined himself storming beaches with a rifle, maybe earning a medal. Instead, he'd spent 2 years wielding wrenches and shovels, building the infrastructure that let other men do the fighting. At first, he'd been disappointed. Where was the glory in construction work? But he'd learned. Every bridge they built saved lives, allowed supplies to reach the front, let wounded men get evacuated, gave tanks and artillery the mobility they needed. The engineers weren't heroes in the newsreels, but they were the reason the Allies kept moving forward. "You know what my old man told me before I shipped out?" DeLuca said, tightening a bolt. He said, "Frank, the world's full of guys who know how to break things. Be one of the guys who knows how to build them." McCaffrey grunted. "Smart man." "Yeah," DeLuca said quietly. He was. Past tense. His father had died of a heart attack 6 months earlier. DeLuca had gotten the telegram while building a bridge over the Moselle. He'd read it, folded it carefully, put it in his pocket, and gone back to work. Because that's what you did. The bridge needed building, and grief was a luxury for peacetime. The crossing began. They didn't know it yet, but this crossing would become the symbol of American engineering audacity, a feat so quick, so methodical, the German officers thought it had to be a bluff. At 1,000 hours, the first pontoon floated out into the current. The men moved like clockwork now, trained,
efficient, almost mechanical. Each section was guided into place by ropes and motors, chained and anchored. Every hammer strike echoed like a heartbeat against the hum of engines. The scale was staggering. Hundreds of engineers working simultaneously on multiple bridge sites, dozens of pontoons moving into position, artillery and air support suppressing German resistance, radio operators coordinating every element. It was industrial warfare at its peak, human organization and mechanical power combining to overwhelm natural barriers. German artillery barked from the east bank. Shells screamed in, bursting along the shore. DeLuca flinched as a chunk of steel whizzed past his ear, slicing his sleeve. Blood seeped through the torn fabric, but the wound was shallow. Someone shouted for medics. Someone else yelled, "Keep it moving." A young private, fresh replacement, couldn't have been more than 18, stood frozen, staring at a body floating in the water. His face had gone white. McCaffrey grabbed his shoulder. "Hey, eyes on your work, not on the river. You can fall apart later. Right now, we build." The kid nodded shakily and picked up his wrench. Air superiority. By noon, the bridge extended halfway across. The Germans, desperate, called for air support, but Allied fighters ruled the skies. P-51 Mustangs swooped in, silencing anti-aircraft positioned with bursts of .50 caliber fire. British Typhoons rocketed German artillery bunkers. American bombers pounded anything that moved on the eastern approaches. The Luftwaffe was finished, gutted by years of attrition, starved of fuel, outclassed by Allied aircraft. A few MiG-262 jets made token appearances, but they were too few and too late to matter. On the water, the engineers barely looked up. They had a deadline. Corporal DeLuca worked through the afternoon in a fog of exhaustion. His movements became automatic. Position pontoon, insert bolt, tighten, move to next connection. His mind wandered. He thought about Brooklyn, about his neighborhood in Bensonhurst, about Sunday dinners with his family, his mother's pasta, his father's stories, his little sister's laughter. Would they still be there when he got home? Would he even recognize them after everything he'd seen? "DeLuca, pay attention," McCaffrey's voice snapped him back to reality. He'd almost walked off the edge of the bridge. One more step and he'd have been in the river. "Sorry, Sarge. Save the daydreaming for after we win the war." The final connection. By mid-afternoon, the last pontoon locked in place. The bridge, shimmering under the sunlight, stretched across the Rhine, a continuous silver thread linking two worlds, the chaos of battle and the promise of victory. General Simpson arrived at the crossing minutes later. His jeep rumbled onto the bridge, the planks creaking under the weight. He stepped out, a tall man with a weathered face and calm eyes that had seen too much war. He gazed across the river with quiet awe, watching tanks and trucks rumble past him toward Germany. "How long?" he asked the supervising officer, Major Richard Davis. The man straightened, pride evident despite his exhaustion. 9 hours, sir, start to finish." Simpson let out a low whistle. 9 hours to cross the Rhine. You boys just rewrote the book. He paused, then added quietly, "Tell your men. Tell them they're the finest engineers in the world, and I've seen a lot of engineers." Major Davis saluted. "Yes, sir. They'll appreciate that, sir." The German perspective. Across the water, German prisoners watched from makeshift cages, stunned, silent. Many were young, some barely 15 or 16. Boys conscripted from the Hitler Youth in Germany's final desperate gamble. One prisoner, an Obergruppeiter, corporal named Klaus Weber, couldn't take his eyes off the bridge. He'd been a carpenter before the war, had built houses and furniture. He understood construction, understood what it took to span a river this size. What he was witnessing shouldn't be possible. He turned to another prisoner, a grizzled Feldwebel, sergeant, who'd fought since Poland in 1939.
Sie haben über Nacht eine Brücke gebaut, Webers whispered. They built a bridge overnight. The sergeant nodded slowly. Das ist warum wir verloren. That is why we are losing. It wasn't about courage. The German army had fought bravely, sometimes brilliantly. It wasn't about technology. German tanks were often better, German guns more powerful. It was about this, about the ability to mobilize resources on an industrial scale, to organize thousands of men into efficient teams, to build faster than the enemy could destroy. For the German High Command, it was more than just a loss of territory. It was a psychological collapse. The Rhine had been Germany's ancient shield, the natural fortress that had protected its heart since Roman legions first reached its banks. Julius Caesar himself had struggled to cross it. Napoleon had been stopped by it. And yet, in less than 10 hours, it had been conquered, not by tanks or bombers, but by wrenches, steel, and human will. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in the West, read the reports with sinking despair. American forces were now across the Rhine at multiple points. British and Canadian forces were pouring across Montgomery's bridges to the north. The French were crossing to the south. The defensive barrier that was supposed to buy Germany months had lasted days. In his memoir, written years later, Kesselring would write, "The speed of American engineering operations was unlike anything in military history. They approached warfare like a construction project, with the same efficiency they brought to building skyscrapers and factories. We couldn't compete with that." Part 4. The human cost. The casualties. As evening fell, convoys began pouring across. Trucks, jeeps, tanks, artillery. The rumble of engines drowned out the river's song. Smoke drifted eastward where the next battles awaited. But amid the triumph, there were the fallen. The 150th Engineer Combat Battalion had lost 23 men during the crossing. 23 names that would be carved on memorial walls, read aloud at ceremonies, remembered by families who'd never see their sons, husbands, or fathers again. Corporal DeLuca helped collect personal effects from the bodies, letters home that would never be sent, photographs of sweethearts and families, dog tags that would be sent back to notify next kin. One body belonged to Private Timothy O'Connor, the kid who'd frozen earlier. He'd been killed by shrapnel during the final hour of construction,
just minutes before the bridge was completed. DeLuca found a letter in O'Connor's pocket, addressed to someone named Mary. The envelope was spattered with mud and blood, but the handwriting inside was neat, careful. "Dear Mary, by the time you get this, I'll probably be home. The war can't last much longer. I'm going to take you to that restaurant I promised, the one with the white tablecloths." DeLuca folded the letter carefully and placed it with O'Connor's effects. He didn't cry, he'd run out of tears months ago. But something hard and cold settled in his chest. This was the cost. For every bridge built, for every mile gained, there was a price paid in young lives that would never be lived. The meaning of victory. Sergeant McCaffrey found DeLuca sitting alone on the bridge after dark, staring at the water. "You okay, kid?" DeLuca shrugged. O'Connor was 18. 18. He should be in college somewhere, chasing girls, worrying about exams. Not this. McCaffrey sat down beside him, lighting a cigarette. "Yeah, war's a bastard that way." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the river and the distant sound of artillery. Finally, McCaffrey spoke. "You know what keeps me going? It's not the medals or the glory. It's knowing that every bridge we build ends this thing a little bit faster. Every river we cross brings us closer to the day when kids like O'Connor can stop dying." He took a drag on his cigarette. "We're not heroes, Frank. We're just guys with wrenches. But maybe that's enough." DeLuca looked out at the bridge, this impossible thing they'd built in 9 hours, this defiance of nature and enemy fire. "We just built a bridge to Berlin," he said softly. McCaffrey clapped him on the shoulder. Then let's make sure they use it. Part 5. The Race to Berlin. April 1945. The Rhine crossings broke Germany's last natural defense. What followed was a race. American, British, and Soviet forces all driving toward Berlin, each hoping to plant their flag first. The engineers kept building. Across the Weser, the Elbe, dozens of smaller rivers whose names no one remembered. Each crossing followed the same pattern: reconnaissance, planning, construction under fire, breakthrough. By April, German resistance was collapsing, not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked everything else: fuel, ammunition, food, hope. Corporal De Luca and the 150th Engineer Combat Battalion found themselves moving so fast they sometimes reached rivers before the Germans could blow the bridges. They'd repair damage, reinforce structures, and wave tanks across, sometimes within hours of arriving. "You know what's weird?" De Luca said to McCaffrey as they worked on yet another bridge. "I used to dream about seeing Paris, Rome, all these famous European cities. Now I've been to dozens of them, and all I've seen is rubble." McCaffrey grunted. "Stick around after the war. They'll rebuild. And who knows, maybe some kid will build something better where your bridge used to be." The end. And as the sun sank over the Rhine on that March evening in 1945, the great river that had once divided Europe now united an army on its unstoppable march to victory. The Germans had destroyed bridges to halt the Allies, but the Americans had learned to build faster than war could tear them down. In the span of a few weeks in March 1945, American engineers had crossed the Rhine at over a dozen points. British engineers had done the same to the north. The barrier was broken. Germany was open. 5 weeks later, on April 30th, Adolf Hitler would commit suicide in his bunker as Soviet shells fell on Berlin. 8 days after that, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Epilogue: The Builders. After the war. Sergeant Bill Carter returned to Nebraska, where he used his GI Bill benefits to start a construction company. He built houses, schools, and bridges, civilian structures meant to last generations. He rarely spoke of the war, but his son once asked him what he was most proud of. Carter thought for a long moment, then said, "The bridges. Because unlike most things in war, we built them to help people, not hurt them." Colonel William M. Hogue rose to the rank of lieutenant general, commanding multiple divisions and eventually serving as commander-in-chief of U.S. Army Europe. But he always considered himself an engineer first, a combat officer second. Corporal Frank De Luca went home to Brooklyn, worked for the New York City Department of Public Works, and helped build the infrastructure of post-war America. He married, had 3 children, and lived until 1998. Before he died, his daughter asked him if he regretted spending the war building bridges instead of fighting. He smiled. "Honey, I was fighting, just with different tools, and what we built lasted longer than anything we destroyed." The legacy. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 represented more than just military success. They symbolized a particular American approach to warfare, one that valued speed, flexibility, and industrial might over traditional military glory. While European generals planned elegant maneuvers and fought for ancient cities, American engineers built the infrastructure that made modern warfare possible. They turned rivers into roads, obstacles into advantages, destruction into progress. The statistics tell part of the story. In the month of March 1945 alone, American Army engineers constructed over 60 bridges across the Rhine and its tributaries. They laid thousands of miles of roadway, cleared countless minefields, and repaired hundreds of destroyed structures. But the real story isn't in the numbers, it's in the men. Part 6. The Science of Speed. The Training Ground. The speed of American bridge construction wasn't accidental, it was the result of years of systematic preparation. Back in 1942, as the U.S. mobilized for war, the Army Engineers School at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, became a factory for producing combat engineers. Thousands of men cycled through its courses, learning not just how to build bridges, but how to build them under the worst possible conditions. Captain James Gamble, an instructor at Fort Belvoir, remembered those days. He said, "We didn't just teach them engineering. We taught them to work exhausted, to work scared, to work while being shot at. We'd blow whistles simulating artillery, fire blanks over their heads, set off smoke grenades. We wanted them to know what it felt like before they ever saw combat." The training was brutally realistic. Men built bridges in the rain, in darkness, in freezing water. They competed against the clock, with instructors screaming that every minute wasted meant American soldiers dying on some distant battlefield. They learned to work in teams where every man knew his role without needing orders. They practiced until the complex became routine, until muscle memory took over when conscious thought failed. Private Eddie Kowalski, who'd frozen in fear during the first Rhine crossing, had gone through that training. So had Corporal DeLuca, Sergeant Carter, and thousands of others. The training didn't make them fearless, but it made them functional despite the fear. The equipment they used was equally important. American industry had revolutionized military engineering in ways that aren't obvious from history books. The M2 Treadway Bridge, for example, was a marvel of modular design. Each section was standardized, interchangeable, and could be assembled by ordinary soldiers with basic tools. It could be transported on trucks, launched from the shore, and strong enough to carry the heaviest tanks. Compare this to earlier wars, where bridges were custom-built by skilled engineers using local materials. That took time that modern warfare couldn't afford. The Americans also developed specialized vehicles, bridge-laying tanks that could deploy spans under fire, amphibious trucks that could ferry equipment across rivers, bulldozers powerful enough to reshape terrain in hours instead of days. But the real innovation was organizational. The U.S. Army treated engineering like a production line, breaking complex tasks into simple steps, training men to perform those steps efficiently, and coordinating everything through radio communication and careful planning. Sergeant Tom McCaffrey put it more bluntly. "We didn't build better bridges than the Germans. We just built them faster. And in war, fast beats perfect every time." The German response. German military leaders studied American bridge building with a mixture of admiration and despair. They understood what they were seeing, a fundamental shift in how wars would be fought. General Gunther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rundstedt, wrote after the war, "The Americans brought to warfare the same efficiency they brought to manufacturing automobiles. Each soldier was a replaceable part. Each piece of equipment was standardized, and the whole machine moved with relentless momentum." It wasn't meant as a compliment, but Blumentritt recognized it was effective. The Soviets, watching from the east, learned the same lessons. After the war, they would copy American engineering techniques wholesale, applying them to Cold War projects from the Arctic to Central Asia. Part 7. The Forgotten Heroes. The cost few remember. While infantry units received medals and war correspondents wrote about tank commanders, the engineers who made it all possible remained largely invisible. The casualty rates tell a grimmer story than the official histories admit. Engineer units suffered proportionally higher
losses than many combat units, not from dramatic battles, but from the grinding attrition of working under constant fire. Artillery claimed men who couldn't take cover while holding bridges in place. Mines killed soldiers clearing roads. Accidents took others, drownings, equipment failures, exhaustion leading to fatal mistakes. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, Sergeant Carter's unit, lost 127 men killed and over 400 wounded during the European campaign. The 150th, DeLuca's battalion, lost 156 dead. These weren't casualties from one big battle, but steady losses accumulated over months of dangerous work. And unlike infantry casualties who died fighting, engineers often died building. There's no glory in drowning while positioning a pontoon, no heroic narrative in being killed by a shell while tightening a bolt. Their families received the same telegrams, the same folded flags, but the newspapers rarely mentioned them. Private First Class James Washington. Remember Private Washington, the combat engineer who crossed in the first assault wave at Oppenheim? His story didn't end with that successful crossing. Washington was African American, part of one of the few integrated engineer units in a still segregated U.S. Army. Black soldiers faced double jeopardy, the dangers of combat, and the racism of their own country. After the Rhine crossings, Washington's unit pushed deeper into Germany. On April 15, 1945, they reached the Dachau concentration camp, one of the first American units to arrive. What he saw there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, in an oral history interview, Washington said, "We'd been building bridges, helping the Army move forward, thinking we were doing something important. Then we saw Dachau, and we understood why it mattered. It wasn't just about defeating Germany, it was about stopping something evil." He paused, then added quietly, "Made those bridges mean something more than just wood and steel." Washington returned to Alabama after the war, where he faced Jim Crow laws and discrimination from the same country he'd risked his life to defend. He became a civil rights activist, using the organizational skills he'd learned in the Army to help coordinate voter registration drives. When asked if he regretted serving, he said, "I regret that I had to fight for freedom overseas while my people didn't have it at home. But I don't regret the service, because someone had to stop Hitler. And if not us, then who?" The unknown engineer. There's a memorial in Remagen, Germany, at the site of the Ludendorff Bridge, the bridge that briefly survived long enough to let thousands of Americans cross before collapsing. The memorial lists the names of engineers who died during the Rhine crossings. There are over 800 names carved into the stone. Most of them you've never heard of. Most of them died doing jobs that seem mundane, positioning pontoons, checking connections, directing traffic. But each death represented a young man who would never go home, never have the life he'd planned. One name stands out, not because the man was special, but because he represents all of them. Private Joseph Miller, 19 years old, from a small town in Illinois. Killed by artillery fire while helping to build a bridge across the Rhine on March 25, 1945. His mother received a telegram on April 2nd. She kept it in a drawer for the rest of her life, folded and refolded so many times the creases wore through. Next to it, she kept his last letter home, written 2 days before he died. "Dear Mom, don't worry about me. The war will be over soon. I'm not doing anything dangerous, just building bridges like I used to help Dad build the barn. I'll be home before you know it. Love, Joe." He was wrong about coming home, but he was right about the bridges. Engineering the victory. The Rhine crossings were spectacular, but they were part of a larger story, the complete re-engineering of European geography to support the Allied advance. From June 1944 to May 1945, American and British engineers built over 1,000 major bridges, cleared over 100,000 miles of roads, removed millions of mines, repaired hundreds of rail lines, constructed dozens of airfields, built entire harbors when existing ports were destroyed. The Mulberry Harbors at Normandy, artificial ports towed across the Channel, represented engineering ambition on a scale that staggers the imagination. Each harbor was the size of Dover, built from scratch, towed 100 miles, and assembled under fire. The Red Ball Express, the supply convoy system that kept Allied armies moving, required engineers to maintain roads that were being destroyed as fast as they could be repaired. Every gallon of fuel, every artillery shell, every meal that reached the front lines got there because engineers built and maintained the infrastructure to move it. General Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, later wrote, "The success of the Allied invasion of Europe was due to 3 things: air superiority, logistics, and engineering. Without any one of those 3, we would have failed." The economic dimension. There's another angle that's often overlooked, the economic dimension of American engineering capability. Building bridges at the speed the Americans did required not just skilled men, but enormous industrial capacity.
Pontoons had to be manufactured in the thousands. Steel, aluminum, and rubber had to be produced in vast quantities. Equipment had to be designed, tested, and mass-produced. This was only possible because America's industrial base was intact and enormous. While European factories lay in ruins, destroyed by years of bombing and fighting, American plants ran 3 shifts, churning out war materiel faster than it could be used. Henry Kaiser shipyards were building Liberty ships in 42 days. Boeing was producing a B-17 bomber every 90 minutes. And American steel mills were producing more metal than the rest of the world combined. The Rhine crossings weren't just military operations. They were demonstrations of American economic power. Germany couldn't compete not because German engineers were less skilled, but because German industry was being bombed to rubble while American industry was untouchable. War had become a contest not of martial valor, but of production capacity. And in that contest, America was unbeatable. The Soviet parallel. While Americans crossed the Rhine from the west, Soviet forces were doing the same from the east, crossing the Oder, the Vistula, and dozens of other rivers. Soviet engineering techniques were different, but equally effective. They used massive quantities of labor, entire divisions dedicated to construction. They accepted higher casualties. They built cruder structures that didn't need to last long. But they moved with the same relentless momentum. German forces found themselves trapped between 2 engineering juggernauts, each building faster than defensive positions could be established. The meeting of American and Soviet forces at the Elbe River in April 1945 was symbolic. 2 armies that had re-engineered an entire continent coming together to finish the job. That famous handshake between American and Soviet soldiers at Torgau took place on a bridge, built by American engineers on one side, Soviet engineers on the other, meeting in the middle. It wouldn't last. Within 2 years, those same engineers would be building fortifications against each other as the Cold War began. But for one moment in April 1945, the bridges symbolized cooperation rather than conflict. What the Rhine crossings taught. Military strategists spent years analyzing the Rhine crossings, drawing lessons that would shape warfare for decades. 1. Speed beats strength. The Germans had stronger fortifications, better defensive positions, and the advantage of fighting from their homeland. None of it mattered because the Allies moved faster. 2. Logistics wins wars. For every soldier who fired a rifle, 10 others worked in support roles, including engineers. Modern warfare is more about supply chains than battle lines. 3. Standardization enables flexibility. Because equipment was interchangeable and procedures were standardized, Americans could adapt quickly to changing conditions. German forces with their custom solutions for every problem couldn't. 4. Industrial capacity determines outcomes. In a war between industrialized nations, the one that can produce more material faster will win, assuming roughly equal military skill. These lessons influenced everything from Cold War planning to modern military doctrine. The U.S. Army's focus on rapid deployment, modular systems, and overwhelming logistics all trace back to lessons learned crossing rivers in 1945. The engineering mindset. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The engineering mindset that treated obstacles as problems to be solved rather than barriers to be feared. When infantry commanders saw the Rhine, they saw an impassable obstacle. When engineer commanders saw it, they saw a construction project with a tight deadline. That difference in perspective, seeing challenges as solvable rather than insurmountable, became a defining characteristic of American military culture. It's why decades later, American forces would build airfields in the Afghan mountains, bridges in Iraqi deserts, and roads through Vietnamese jungles. The specific challenges changed, but the mindset remained. There's no obstacle that can't be overcome with enough determination and proper tools. Sergeant McCaffrey expressed it more simply. An engineer's job is to make the impossible merely difficult, and the difficult routine. After the bridges. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the engineers didn't stop working. Destroyed infrastructure had to be rebuilt. Roads needed repair for occupation forces. Bridges that had been hastily constructed under fire needed reinforcement or replacement for civilian use. Corporal Frank DeLuca found himself in Munich in June
1945, helping to rebuild a bridge over the Isar River, not for military purposes, but to help German civilians resume normal life. It felt strange. For 2 years, he'd been destroying German infrastructure or building temporary structures for military use. Now he was helping Germans rebuild their country. "Seems weird, doesn't it?" said Private Kowalski, who'd survived the war and remained in DeLuca's squad. "6 months ago, we were shooting at these people. Now we're building bridges for them." DeLuca shrugged. "That's what engineers do. We build. Doesn't matter who it's for." A young German woman approached them one day while they worked. She was thin, wearing clothes that had been patched many times, carrying a small child. She spoke a little English. "Thank you," she said, simply. "My family, other side of river. This bridge, I can see them now." DeLuca nodded awkwardly. He didn't know what to say. She wasn't thanking him for winning the war. She was thanking him for building something that connected her to what she'd lost. Maybe that was what engineering was really about. Not the bridges themselves, but what they connected. Not the structures, but the human needs they served. Going home. By late 1945, the point system determined who went home first. Men with more time in service, more combat experience, more family responsibilities got priority. Sergeant Bill Carter shipped out in October 1945. He stood on the deck of the transport ship, watching Europe fade behind him, and felt empty. Not happy, not sad, just hollow. He'd spent 3 years building and destroying, seeing friends die, living with fear and exhaustion. Now it was over, and he was supposed to just go back to normal life? How do you explain to people back home what it was like to build a bridge while shells fell around you? How do you describe the weight of knowing that if you failed, men would die? How do you sleep when you're not waking up every few hours to the sound of artillery? The transition from war to peace was harder than anyone expected. The engineers came home to parades and celebrations, but inside, they were still halfway across some river, hands numb with cold, working against the clock. In 1965, 20 years after the war, survivors of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion held their first reunion in Omaha, Nebraska. Sergeant Carter, now Bill Carter, successful contractor and father of 3, attended reluctantly. He hadn't stayed in touch with anyone from his unit. The war was something he'd tried to leave behind. But when he walked into that hotel conference room and saw the other men, older now, grayer, thicker around the middle, something broke open inside him. These were the only people in the world who understood, who knew what it had been like, who carried the same memories. They spent 2 days trading stories, laughing at old jokes, remembering the men who hadn't made it home. They didn't talk about the fear or the trauma. That wasn't how men of their generation processed things. But the understanding was there, unspoken. On the last night, someone proposed a toast. "To the bridges we built." Everyone stood, glasses raised. Carter added quietly, "And to the men who built them." They drank in silence, each man lost in his own memories of dark rivers and the impossible things they'd accomplished together. The story of the Rhine crossings isn't really about bridges. It's about ordinary men who, when faced with impossible tasks, simply did them. They weren't supermen. They were farm boys from Iowa, mechanics from Detroit, college kids from Brooklyn. They got scared. They made mistakes. They wanted to go home. But when orders came to build a bridge across a river under enemy fire, they did it. Not because they were heroes,
but because it was their job, because the men beside them were doing the same thing, because stopping wasn't an option. In 10 hours, they could build what ancient engineers would have needed months to accomplish. In a single night, they conquered barriers that had protected nations for millennia. They did it with wrenches and hammers, with cold hands and tired bodies, with determination that refused to accept failure. The tanks that rolled across those bridges got the headlines. The infantry that stormed across got the medals. But it was the engineers, the men with muddy boots and blistered hands, who made victory possible. Legacy in steel and concrete. Many of those emergency bridges, built in 1945, are long gone, replaced by modern structures built for peace. But some survived. In Remagen, pieces of the original pontoon bridge are preserved in a museum. In Oppenheim, markers show where American engineers crossed the Rhine in darkness. And in towns across Germany, elderly citizens still remember the American engineers who rebuilt their bridges not for military advantage, but because it was the right thing to do. The Rhine still flows, as it has for millennia. But it no longer represents an impassable barrier. Modern bridges cross it everywhere, carrying commerce and tourists rather than armies. Those modern bridges stand on foundations laid by the engineers of 1945, not physical foundations, but the proof that no river is too wide, no current too strong, no challenge too great. When Corporal Frank DeLuca died in 1998, his daughter found a box in his attic. Inside were photographs of bridges, the Rhine, the Ruhr, the Elbe, dozens of others. On the back of each photo he'd written a date and a number. Rhine, Oppenheim, March 22, 1945, 8 hours. She asked her mother what the numbers meant. "That's how long it took him to build it," she said. He always said those were the most important things he ever did. Not the bridges themselves, but proving it could be done. And maybe that's the final lesson of the Rhine crossings, that the impossible is only impossible until someone does it. The engineers who crossed the Rhine didn't think of themselves as making history. They were just doing their jobs, building bridges, trying to survive long enough to go home. But in doing their jobs, they changed what was possible. They proved that determination and organization could overcome any obstacle. They demonstrated that ordinary men, working together, could accomplish extraordinary things. The bridges they built are mostly gone now, replaced by better structures built in peacetime. But what they proved, that courage and stubbornness and American engineering could conquer any barrier, that legacy remains. Cast in steel, forged in determination, built by men who refused to be told something couldn't be done. The engineers who crossed the Rhine, the men who built the road to victory, plank by plank, bolt by bolt, across the last great river of the war.